For Kazunori Yamauchi, his love of cars goes back as far as he can remember. In his hometown, he would watch cars go by and his father would tell him what kind of model it was. Eventually, he could remember all model types in his hometown. As he grew up, he dreamed of becoming a race driver, owning lots of different sports cars in his young adult years, including a Toyota Celica and Nissan Skyline GTR, street racing them regularly, and also developed a huge interest in 3D graphics, developing video games as a hobby on his personal computer. There was even a moment when he went to a game arcade in the early 80s and wasn't impressed. He wanted to drive real cars. So with both interests combined, it seemed like destiny for what would become a decade later. By the early 90s, Yamauchi was working for a game team part of Sony's Music Entertainment, and transferred to a new software group to make games for their upcoming PlayStation, just after Sony decided to enter the video game industry alone, playing a role in developing the software of the console and design of the controller. For him, this was the perfect opportunity to create his dream project. Officially at first, his pitch for a simulation racer was rejected because having hundreds of real-life car models with such detail in one game was too radical of an idea. So what did his team do? They started development on it anyway. But what he also did was pitch other game ideas which were sort of similar. Under the name Poly's Entertainment, one of them was Motortoon Grand Prix, an early Japanese exclusive, while the sequel got a wider release, and was one of the first kart races to enter 3D before Mario Kart 64. But to the developers, these were experimental titles that increased their knowledge of the PlayStation, a brainstorm session for features to add to their Gran Turismo project, which was eventually greenlit after all the work Yamauchi's team put in, but it wasn't exactly a Sunday dry throughout development. In an era when a video game can take a year or two to make, it took Poly's 5 years to make Gran Turismo, and according to Kaz, the development team basically lived in the offices they were making the game in, only visiting their homes a few days a year, and almost completely lost their sense of time and season, which explains why there are so many models from the early 90s. The team was also kept deliberately small with only 20 people max, so for each member their roles and responsibilities were very important, and kept the budget for the project smaller. Therefore, Sony gave them complete freedom to do whatever they want, and put in features that hadn't been seen before, including when you corner, the car slightly tilts, and when you slide out, it bounces about. Whatever upgrades you made, it noticeably alters the car's performance, and there are a lot of options, and was one of the earliest games to use environmental mapping to accurately match the lighting and reflection of the cars based on where you are on the track. Cars that looked and moved the way they did in a video game in 1997 with barely any technical hiccups during gameplay was unheard of, and Poly's only wanted to release it when it was finished, not meet a deadline. So given their history of doing this with nearly every title in the series, it's been said that Gran Turismo 7, for example, is scheduled for a 2022 release at the time of this video. Don't be surprised if it's delayed to another year or two. Like a lot of games that would redefine a genre, developers expected a niche product, and with marketing, when it made its E3 debut in 1997 for example, it wasn't even officially announced. What Sony did was add it in a mashup of all the upcoming PlayStation titles that year. That way anyone who saw it would most likely wonder what that game is. It must have been extremely effective, because when Gran Turismo was released on December 1997 and the rest of the world by May 1998, it literally became the all-time #1 best-selling game on the PlayStation with nearly 11 million copies sold. According to Kaz, it came as a shock to the team, not just because of how successful it was, but because they worked on this game for so long. It became their lives. They felt as though the game belonged to them. So when they saw long lines of people waiting to buy the game, it didn't belong to them anymore. Now today, we refer to it as the first Gran Turismo, that first one on the PS1. Although I only played it sporadically growing up and I never had it in my collection back then, it was one of the earliest games I remember playing, with one locked memory of racing with a purple Nissan Skyline GTR on a racing track set at night back in the late 90s or early 2000s. Although when I had a PlayStation 2, I did have Gran Turismo 3 and 4. And it was around the mid-2010s, just before I created this channel, did my interest in games I played as a kid rejuvenate. And out of curiosity, I decided to get the Gran Turismo titles for the PlayStation 1, and these reviews were the first real attempt at these games, the Gran Turismo mode from these titles. And again, I loved them. But back when I reviewed them, I only had 20-something subscribers, where reaching the number of subs I have now was unthinkable. And like a lot of reviews throughout the first year, I always thought it could be a way better video. Not to mention the lack of time in my life, a good excuse to play these games again and do something productive with it. I miss the simple, no-nonsense presentation of the first few games. It's like the developers drove through a construction area in Tokyo on one of the rare days they were outside the office and thought, aha! I know talking about how a menu looks in a racing game sounds very trivial, but it was another part of the nostalgia that hit me coming back to this game. Even the first Gran Turismo specifically has a unique style from the rest. It feels darker, tech, and industrial in comparison, not just the menu but the gameplay with the music and darker color schemes. Snapshots of racing at night used more prominently, and even the game's cover. I also like how exaggerated the circuits are, how steep that mountain is in the distance of Autumn Ring. The makings on the test course make the one in Monza look like Sochi, and my favourite special stage Route 5, seeing endless sponsors above and around the track. I love how excessive it is. It's one of those things that distinguish this game from the rest of the series. Almost like a time capsule in a way, seeing how safety has evolved over the years. The revisions look more boring in comparison. Maybe it's the pixelated graphics of the PlayStation that add to the charm, seeing the car's lighting and reflection match fairly accurately. And was an era of motorsport before things looked overly glamorous. Point is, the look of nearly every circuit varies, and all of them are staples that reappear throughout the series. And if you complete all the GT League events, there's a hi-fi mode which runs the game at a smooth frame rate as a bonus feature to show off the fact that it can do it on the PlayStation, hence why this review is in 60 frames per second. However, one thing I didn't mention in my older review is the soundtrack, that the Japanese version sounds very different to the rest of the world. In that one, the music is all original by the same composer and sounds more like it belongs in Gran Turismo 2, whereas the PAL and NTSC versions use the licensed sound to make the game appear more exciting for us non-Japanese players. At least that's my theory. Couldn't believe I only found out recently. I always wondered why I never heard Moon Over the Castle when playing this game. Though I think it was the right call because it's obviously a great soundtrack overall. I mean, the way it presents itself alone is enough to make this game worth reviewing again. But actually playing the game? Well, that's a slightly different story, and that wasn't an understatement, hear me out. With 10,000 credits, you can only buy so much from a used dealership, which is fair. Start small and climb the motorsport ladder. However, you don't just buy a car and start racing, you need a license first. And if you've seen my previous reviews of the Gran Turismo games, you'll know that it's my least favourite part of all of them. The first couple of tests where you drive in a straight line and stop at the checkered point is ridiculed by nearly every person who reviews these games. But I'll try and be reasonable in this case. I'm not saying it shouldn't be in the game at all. For some, it could be a legit way to learn about speed into a corner, racing lines, all that stuff. And if you're entering a world of motorsport in real life, you'll need racing licenses to be allowed to race. But since the tests are set on parts of all the tracks in which I've probably clocked over 1,000 laps on collectively, and the International A license is just a time trial run, I just wish it wasn't mandatory every time you start another career mode when you know what to expect from the driving mechanics. Otherwise, it feels like an absolute grind. Not to mention hard to simply pass a test compared to the rest of the series, maybe only behind Gran Turismo 4. Every time I see that, it feels like a gold medal. So after earning all these licenses, you can finally enter a race event. Now by today's standards, the number of events is quite tame. That's all you have to do, 14 championships and 3 endurance races to compete in. Even if you include the ladder, this game would take roughly 10-15 hours to 100% it. Almost like Gran Turismo Sport offline. For example, as great as these racetracks are, if you look at the list, it can feel repetitive after a while driving the same one since there are only 11 of them if you include all variations. But take yourself back to 1998 and compare Gran Turismo to other racing games at the time. For the most part, there was single race, a championship mode, and maybe a couple of other game modes unique to that game, like Hot Pursuit and Need for Speed, or Battle and Mario Kart, as well as other races that center on one championship like Formula 1 or British Touring Car Championship. But thanks to the number of cars available in Gran Turismo, you have multiple event types available based on drivetrain, endurance, nationality, and difficulty based on the license required to enter them, encouraging players to drive lots of different cars. And I think that's what made Gran Turismo so attractive to players all over the world. A lot of people had a favorite car and there was something for everybody here. Just the idea of licensed cars in a game wasn't insanely radical. Need for Speed and Test Drive did this before, but not on the sheer volume as Gran Turismo back then. Okay, being a Japanese developed game, that's all you get pretty much, with only a few manufacturers from the rest of the world appear in this game. Even then, there are only a couple of models to choose from. And a lot of these cars are just different badges and years of the same model, which means the chances of buying more than one used car as you advance through the GT mode are slim to nil. Therefore, the number of cars claimed to be in this game is all over the place. It says 290 on the back of the cover, while others claim it's closer to 140. Should we put race modified options into consideration? But regardless, that's a decent number of cars, even by today's standards. In fact, that's roughly the same number of cars as Gran Turismo Sports on launch day. And speaking of the cover, I like that the back of the manual has every single car model named. Imagine how thick the Gran Turismo 6 manual would be if it did the same thing. Every car is designed to handle and sound exactly the way it does in real life. Obviously, as the simulation racing genre has evolved over the years, if you compare the driving mechanics to what the series is now, it's simple enough to qualify this game as an arcade racer. Like, look at the way this car is flying all over the place without a damaged model. It seems to happen a lot on Trial Mountain. And if you enter arcade mode, the mechanics feel even lighter, and the circuits are altered with a few jumps. Like, if you compare the gameplay and lap times, you can see the difference. But at the very least, nearly everyone I drove in this playthrough handled differently from the last one. And a lot of it has to do with the car's drivetrain, whether it's front, rear, or four-wheel drive, different characteristics, power, and grip levels. For example, one car might handle well enough, but another can easily slide out, even in a straight line. And since there are no pressure-sensitive button controls for accelerating and braking, and for a brief period the DualShock controller wasn't even out yet, so there was no analog handling, it's harder to drive some of the faster cars than you think on first impression. In fact, I'm so used to racing games where the controls involve the trigger buttons for braking and accelerating, whenever I play a PS1 or 2 racer, I always reconfigure the buttons like so, which works really well for this game in particular. So you enter the Sunday Cup, assuming you win it, on to the next one, right? Well, what absolutely caught me off guard was the difficulty spike right after you win your first championship, so you're guaranteed to race in the same event multiple times to get anywhere in GT mode, whether it's saving up for a new car or performance upgrade. Fortunately, I didn't have to do this as many times as I first feared, but before then, for this playthrough, playing it properly for the first time in 5 years, I was also caught off guard by just how much of a spike it is. I bought a faster car for the other events and it still wasn't cutting it. And most of it is thanks to the opponent AI rubber banding, which was common in a lot of racing games and frequently puts you at a disadvantage. You'll find yourself mostly blasting off into the lead up to the first corner, and yet opponents stay behind you the whole time. Either that or they easily drive past you like you're a time trial ghost. Makes you wonder why they bothered adding a qualifying format to all the races. Again, another thing part of racing in real life, but you can slide out at the very start and retake the lead on the same lap. And again, opponents always seem to keep close for the rest of the race. I mean, look at the gap between all drivers from first to last, literally only a couple of seconds. Arcade mode is no different. If anything, it's more obvious. There's more strategy in choosing the right car before the race even begins. Now that is how you overtake cleanly in this game. Since there's no damage model, dirty driving seems like the only solution to combat the rubber banding, bashing the opponent as you're going around the corner. And don't just take my word for it, even the game's demo shows the opponents doing the same thing. That's the sound effect you'll recognize the most in this game. Another solution would be to modify your car, another revolutionary feature of the racing genre. Well, not revolutionary, but it was the Gran Turismo games that introduced me to names of different car parts like suspension, brakes, and drivetrain. When I was a little kid, keep in mind. You can also tune a car to your liking, but slapping enough upgrades is usually good enough. There's even a race modify option for nearly every car model. These seem like the only way to get anywhere in this game, or otherwise you'll do what I did and literally spend over an hour going nowhere. At first I wanted to see if it was virtually possible, since I didn't want to weasel my way through with a one-sided car, but I suppose like motorsport in real life, you throw enough money at it, eventually you start winning. However, this makes the game too easy. Basically, whatever approach you take with the GT mode, there's no even balance with the difficulty, with only a couple of events providing it, like the GT World Championship for example. And even then, a mistake near the end after a flawless race, you lose everything. I guess if you look at it from an RPG perspective, you're essentially a weakling to start with, earning enough to fully upgrade it in preparation for the levels which have certain rules to follow. Is that considered cheating? I know Gran Turismo's slogan is the real driving simulator, but it's still a video game at the end of the day. Fortunately, it's still just as fun to drive all these cars as it was in 1998, and need I remind you about that soundtrack? Like the first couple of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater games I reviewed recently, here you have a mega debut, but 20 plus years later, you need to have grown up with it to still enjoy it for what it is, seeing how much the rest of the series has evolved, with its direct PS1 sequel alone being better in every single way with triple the content. Mind you, the first Gran Turismo has aged better as a video game than this. But also like the Tony Hawk games, it triggers a lot of what makes a video game so addictive, collecting cars, reading their specs and info, and driving all of them. I know it's cliche by this point, but the nostalgia really hits home with this one. After Gran Turismo became the #1 best-selling game on the PlayStation, it spawned a franchise that became a byword for technical achievements on every system Sony released. It turned Poly's Entertainment from an internal development team into a fully fledged first-party studio, and though it didn't invent the genre simulation racer, it certainly started the trend, at least on home consoles. Gran Turismo was simply the best for its time, a true pioneer that deserves our respect. Something that anybody should definitely come back to every once in a while, like I did. And considering how many copies it sold, that's a lot of you, right?